In 1870, Democrats in Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, which required segregated railroad cars for black and white passengers. 18 prominent activists in New Orleans united a year later to form the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act. The Citizens Committee joined forces with the East Louisiana Railroad Company, who opposed the law because of the cost of buying extra railroad cars. The Citizens Committee set out to nullify the law through the courts, and in order to construct a test case, they first needed someone to get arrested, a brave individual to stand against Jim Crow.
Homère Plessy was a French-speaking Creole from Louisiana born on March 17, 1862. Plessy's social advocacy work had him involved with the Citizens Committee, a civil rights group made up of black, whites, and Creoles.
Light skin would allow him to inconspicuously enter a whites-only railroad car. And on June 7, 1892, Plessy successfully boarded the East Louisiana Railroad. When the train began moving, Plessy stood and announced to the conductor that, under Louisiana's one-drop rule, he was legally black. The railroad company had prepared the conductor. He stopped the train. Then, a private detective who had been hired by the Citizens Committee stepped onto the train and asked Plessy to exit. When he refused, the detective arrested Homère Plessy. The Citizens Committee appealed to a district court, claiming Plessy's arrest was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The case ascended the court system, and in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson arrived at the United States Supreme Court. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana segregation law in a 7-1 ruling. The majority opinion argued that separate facilities could be equal. The decision introduced a new social doctrine, separate but equal. Now armed with a constitutional basis for segregation, states throughout the South passed laws mandating stricter separation of the races. Instead of ending segregation, Plessy v. Ferguson had ushered in the era of Jim Crow.
Conflict over black emancipation is as old as the nation. In 1861, the South left the Union. At first, Abraham Lincoln saw the struggle as simply a war to save the nation. But in time, he would recast the Civil War as a war to end slavery. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederate States. 6 months after the South surrendered, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. But they had heard rumors that their future was at risk. Lincoln had been assassinated, and a Southerner, Andrew Johnson, was president. Johnson fought to save the Union, but not to free slaves. "This is a country for white men," he said. Whites demanded that the informal practices, which had segregated the races since 1865, become legalized and strictly enforced. Special Jim Crow cars were set aside on trains for black men and women, and for those white men who wanted to smoke and drink. In 1884, Ida B. Wells, a young teacher from Memphis, was quietly reading in a first-class car when the conductor ordered her to move to the Jim Crow car.
I refused, saying the forward car was a smoker and I was in the ladies' car. I proposed to stay. He tried to drag me out of my seat, but the moment he caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth on the back of his hand. Ida B. Wells.
They are able to get her out of the seat, but she refuses to go into that combination car. And she gets off the train, walks back to town with her dress torn, with her hat now askew. She will sue the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. She takes this mighty corporation to court, and she does prevail in the end, because the judge does say that indeed she was a lady. She's a school teacher. She was dressed the way she was supposed to dress. She acted accordingly.
But the victory was short-lived. The verdict was overturned by a Tennessee appeals court.
I had firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would give us justice. I feel shorn of that belief and utterly discouraged.
she began to realize that even black people, middle-class black people, could be victims of that. And she talks about how until that happened, she had believed that those excesses, what she called excesses against the race, were only directed against those people who had perhaps done something to deserve it.
The dailies of our city say that whites must rule this country. But this is an expression without a thought.
We are not the Negro from whom the chains of slavery fell a quarter of a century ago. Most assuredly not. We are now qualified as being the equal of whites and should be treated as such.